The big question mark when it comes to the trade bazooka, it's never been used before, and using it on the US for the first time would be a pretty drastic move. Using it on a smaller trading partner, a trading partner that doesn't have the potential to completely derail the European economy is one thing, but using it on the US is another, and that's why we're hearing a lot of threats, but really the actual steps to implementing this have not been taken.
Yeah, hi Marie. What economic weapons does the EU even have? When we talk about this potential for economic warfare, what's on the EU's side, do you think?
Let me first focus on the anti-coercion instrument, also known as the Trade Bazooka. This is an instrument that was developed in 2023 with the idea of protecting the EU against economic coercion by third states. So when one country is trying to pressure the European Union in any way through economics, so through tariffs, for example. And this is a way for the EU to act. And what's special about this trade bazooka, so-called trade bazooka, is the fact that it doesn't need every single member state to agree in order to be used. So only 15 of 27 member states need to be on board in order for this instrument to kick in. And it's much broader than sanctions. So it also includes options like excluding, in this case, American companies from public procurement contracts, excluding services coming in from the United States, so financial services being exported from the US to the EU. So you have much more variety in terms of what you can target with this tool, and you can fine-tune it much more easily.
I mean, I guess with the bazooka was the one that everyone really talked about, right? And you reported on this as well, Marie, and got a lot of attention about this idea of what is the bazooka. First of all, cool name, right?
Yeah,
usually
love it.
EU things don't have such a cool,
Explosive,
punchy kind of name. So it gets a lot of attention. I get the point about it, you only needing a qualified majority for it. Was there a qualified majority there? Obviously, this is case specific,
in the
right?
Greenland case.
In the Greenland case, because this is the first time we've really heard this kind of talk about, there were about 1 million op-eds written that said it's time to use it, don't use it. But were nations in a position to use this or come close to using it? How would you look at it?
Well, France called on the EU, so Emmanuel Macron, the French president, he called on the European Union to use this tool. But in order for this to actually go into action, like many EU things, a lot of steps still would have had to happen, or a few steps would have still had to happen, which is that the Commission would have had to launch basically an investigation into whether this warrants using the trade bazooka, and then it would have taken maybe 2 weeks for all the paperwork to be in order for then to be a vote on this. So, but it never got this far because EU leaders met pretty quickly after this suggestion was put in the room by Macron, and decided not to go forward because the US actually backed away quite quickly. So we don't know if the EU would have had this majority, the 15 member states, and that's also kind of the big question mark when it comes to the trade bazooka. It's never been used before, and using it on the US for the first time would be a pretty drastic move. Using it on a smaller trading partner, a trading partner that doesn't have the potential to completely derail the European economy is one thing, but using it on the US is another, and that's why we're hearing a lot of threats, but really the actual steps to implementing this have not been taken yet.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where we say, oh, by the way, there is this quick and easy measure. They don't even need to get everyone on board. There doesn't need to be unanimity. We just need a qualified majority.
Just 2 weeks.
Yeah, and then we spend 2 weeks talking about it, and then we don't even get to the vote before it doesn't happen. In this case, the problem still stands that you need to get everyone around the table. You need to have these discussions and debates. I mean, no one is saying that you should just be able to launch something unilaterally.
I mean, to be fair, a lot of the tariff announcements, they only go into effect later. And so there's a lot of lead-up time to when they actually enter effect. And that's part of the whole process as well. And obviously for the bazooka, that's what it's there for as well, is to say we are going to enact it. We're coming close. We're about to take a vote. There's a lot that can happen in that time.
I mean, and even then, if they do agree to implement something, it's up to the member states to actually implement it. And so if they are lax in implementing any particular anti-coercion method or some sort of trade defense method or procurement access, then they could just be lax on that.
Public procurement is also European on a European level, right? Or deciding to exclude players like big US tech companies, that's also something that can be decided on a European level. So it's not that the EU doesn't wield any influence in this. And I agree with you that it feels as though I've been reporting on this bazooka being threatened or being on the table, being pointed at the US probably 3 or 4 times in the last year. And we don't really even get to the point of where we're asking how can this be implemented, because it's kind of clear that it's only a threat. But
isn't that the point?
On the other hand, this is a pretty detrimental weapon that has an implication for hundreds of millions of people. And I mean, maybe I'm devil's advocate, but it's also good that you can't just easily use this weapon, right? There is also a point for debate and for procedures that we're maybe not seeing in the US, and that's also what the Supreme Court said, right?
But when it comes to people like Scott Bessent, who in Davos said, that he basically isn't worried about what the EU is going to do because they might create a dreaded working group, and basically said that he doesn't expect, therefore, any tough action, a tough response against the United States. At Davos. Absolutely. Because, he feels like he can be, basically. There is no serious threat coming from the EU when it comes to especially the big players like the US and China. And on the Chinese side of things, there's been a lot of complaints about cheap products flooding into the EU, and they have done things, but they're very limited to market-based measures and trying to balance the playing field and this kind of thing. There is no kind of swagger like you get from Trump, where he's able to throw his weight around.
27 different nations, Daniel.
But this is the point, right? If they can't act in any sort of united way, then they can't use that power that they have behind it. I mean, there's plenty of very specific things which the EU has on its side. I mean, ASML, for example, that makes the machines that makes the world's biggest
chip
chips.
lithographer. That's right.
Yeah.
They own something like 60 to 90% of the market, depending on the estimates, for what they do, which is basically designing these chips, so creating the lithography for these chips that are so critical. So that includes, obviously, the AI chips that are so fundamental right now across the world in such high demand. So I've heard this talked about before, that ASML is something that Europe has that really is a kind of choke point. I don't know. It's really interesting. That is a real theoretical point. They've stopped shipping to China, I think, a couple of years ago, and it's hard to imagine where that goes if that was dangled. Yeah. But I find it fascinating. I think it is one example you can clearly point to.
Yeah, and it feels like that
Europe has Another one is also this regulatory power that the EU has. Regulatory power Europe, that sounds extremely unsexy, but it's potent, because the Commission has fined, the European Commission has fined, for just in December, it fined 120 million euros because it was breaching the Digital Services Act. And so what that does is it shows that the EU has might, and it does enforce its rules, and that has a real impact on American companies. And it's a clear example that the EU isn't completely impotent.
Yeah, but on the other hand, the EU isn't going, first of all, it's not going to push back too far because there could be retaliation from the US side. So I think that's something that they'd be worried about. And I think also they're worried when it comes to the full tech stack, let's say using Microsoft Windows on your computer, or using OpenAI, ChatGPT, or this kind of thing. All of these parts are very integral to even how public services run inside Europe. A full unilateral pullout of all US tech is not going to happen, because we don't have the kind of stuff that we can use to replace all of that.
Yeah.
Now, France says that it's going to move towards open source software in order to remove one of these threat vectors, economic threat vectors that the US has over France. But that doesn't mean the rest of Europe is going to do the same. And it also is limited to very specific things where you can easily replace what you've got at the moment with open source software.
I am curious, Marie, what do you hear when you bring up these points? Because obviously, it's true. The EU is a huge customer of American tech. It's a huge customer of American LNG. But is it going to cut its nose off to spite its face? Just to prove a point, essentially, or to get at something, to get at the U.S. in a way that's ultimately going to harm itself? I mean, is there not an acknowledgement of this?
There is an acknowledgement of the fact that the EU knows, or the European Commission knows, that it can only go so far. We saw it with the investigation into Grok launched at the end of January, where Elon Musk's AI bot Grok was generating pictures generating naked pictures of well-known people, which was going against European law. And the EU eventually launched an investigation, but it waited. It had already basically prepared, the Commission had prepared the documents necessary and the proof necessary to demonstrate that it would launch an investigation into this. But according to some insiders, the cabinet of von der Leyen actually waited with going public with this until the Greenland crisis cooled down somewhat. So they waited until the week after Davos to go public with this. And this shows that the EU has these instruments and has a lot of might, but that it's also very dependent on the United States and worried about the wrath of Donald Trump. And realistically, I mean, as long as the European Union is dependent on Donald Trump militarily when it comes to Ukraine and when it comes to NATO, these giant weapons aren't going to be fired at the United States. And we saw that when the EU entered this trade deal last year that was completely lopsided, that basically put 0% tariffs on US products coming into the EU, but 15% tariff on European products going to the US. And everybody knew it was lopsided, but everybody knows why. It's because the EU is very, very dependent on the United States. Economically, yes, but I think almost the more prevalent the feeling of dependency here is militarily. And there is a push within Brussels to become more independent. That's really what a lot of the European Council, so the member state meetings, are about right now. It's how do we become more competitive? So how do we strengthen our own economy? And how do we become independent? Be that militarily, economically, in terms of supply chains, etc. So it is the topic that everybody's talking about here because these past months have made it strikingly obvious.
That was just a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip, where we cover money stories that cross borders.
If you'd like more, just scan the QR code at the bottom of your screen and you can listen to full episodes and subscribe.